Give me the go sign, EJ.
Not doing it right, Steve. You should twist it in one way. If it doesn't work,
Yeah, it only went.
All right, well,
Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our monthly webinar series on the Korean Peninsula, sponsored by the Universal Peace Federation. Our goal in these webinars is to see a peaceful solution to the unfortunate reality of the divided Korean Peninsula. Each week, we gather to hear from experts with different perspectives on the issues, security perspectives, political, economic, and business, intercultural, or rather interreligious and cultural issues and perspectives as well. Today's program is being provided by the International Association for Peace and Economic Development. My name is Alan Jessen. I'll be your moderator today. It's my pleasure. We have two speakers today, and then we'll field questions from you, our audience. So you can enter questions in the chat box. We'll try to get to a few of them. If you can bring up our first speaker, Mr. Bill Brown, and I'll introduce him in a minute. But the title for today's presentation is The Economy Under Kim Il-sung. Can Kim Jong Un learn lessons from his grandfather on the limits of Juche and the planned economy? So as we know, the DPRK under Kim Jong Un's leadership faces many challenges as he tries to accomplish the goal of national self-reliance and under the Soviet model of a planned economy. That's the issue we're discussing today, the one that is cut off from the international financial system of the free world. So this program will take a look back at the cultural context and economic realities in the early days under Kim Il-sung and gain some perspective from that. What did he inherit at the end of the Japanese colonial rule? What communication and decisions were made in building the economy of North Korea? Could there be lessons that the grandson, Kim Jong Un, might learn and apply today to deliver a more efficient, productive economy for the betterment and future of North Korea? So that is our topic today. We're very pleased to introduce Mr. Bill Brown. He is the chair of the, was a member and I think formerly of the board of directors of the Korea Economic Institute of America. He's chair of the George Washington University's North Korea Economic Forum in the Institute of Korean Studies. And he's an adjunct professor at the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service, where he teaches occasional courses on the Chinese, Japanese, and Korean economies. He also teaches contemporary China at the University of Merrill Global College. His career as an economist and East Asia specialist has included extensive work in the CIA, Commerce Department, and the National Intelligence Council. He was raised in Gwangju, Korea by Presbyterian missionary parents who themselves were born and raised in China and Korea, respectively. So, Mr. Brown, we're very pleased to have you share with us your some of your research, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks a lot. And I see Joe Chung. I haven't seen him in a long time, a good friend of mine from way back there. What I've done here, about a year ago, I was asked to contribute a chapter to a book, that's just coming out next month. The new book is by, let's see, it's, let me get the title exactly. North Korean Political Economy by Chang Min-hwa. There are a bunch of different authors. You know, we each contribute a chapter. My chapter is the second chapter, and it's on Kim Il-sung's economy, or what I titled it exactly is Self-Reliance Economy under Kim Il-sung. It's about 23 pages, 25 pages. So I did this research about a year ago, and what I'll do today is sort of go through some of the key points from it. I should say from the beginning, I'm not an historian, and I'm kind of in awe of historians, to tell you the truth. My older sister's a China historian. The way historians are so diligent in going through sourcing material. I'm not quite so diligent, I must admit. But I go through this historical material looking for economic concepts that I think a lot of people miss or don't really quite understand. So that's what I've tried to do here, and bring out some lessons that we can learn, but I think what I'd really want, of course, is for the North Korean government to learn, Kim Jong Un himself to learn from the experiences of Kim Il-sung, which are very well recorded in history. We have very good access to Kim Il-sung's speeches. He wrote many, many speeches and books. The country was much more prolific then in terms of putting out data. Really quite interesting, we have all this diplomatic traffic from the East European countries back to their home capitals from the 50s and 60s. All of this is at the Woodrow Wilson Cold War Center, and I'd really encourage y'all to look at that. They have all this material, there's huge amounts of it. It's fun to look at. You can, it's electronic, so you can search by code, by word, whatever. It's really fun to do. So that's what I've done. And I've looked at North Korea, better part of, John can contest to this, for like 35, 40 years, back, not always, but back and forth. And I learned quite a lot doing this research about Kim Il-sung. So what I thought I'd do is quickly go through some of the, I'm not going to read it, but of course, but I'll go through some of the chapter headings and give some points out that hopefully will lead to a good discussion. I'm sure John, others will have some different views on what I have to say. Just one example, and maybe you can put this up on the screen now, from what we can learn and use can you put this, my little article from last year? Yeah, this article here. This is from my webpage, by the way. If anybody, it's free and no ads, so real easy to use. Just type in that website thing up there, naeia.com, and you'll get everything I write on North Korea. I do something every couple of weeks usually. This is an article I wrote a year ago, and I wrote it after looking at this little item. Yeah, right there, right there. Stop there. Agrarian reform in liberated Korea. This is a little line in KCNA, and I looked at that, read it. I'd been working on this paper, this chapter, and it rang a bell. So, oh, I know what he's talking about. What the little one-liner is, KCNA, March 5th, as the first work for democratic reforms in Korea after its liberation from Japan's colonial rule, the agrarian reform was successfully enforced under the wise guidance of President Kim Il-sung to realize the centuries-old desire of the peasants. So millions of North Koreans would read this and they study it. You know, they study these KCNA very carefully. What's the question? I wonder, what is the centuries-old desire of the peasant? Well, if you go back and look at Kim Il-sung's works, 1960, different points of time, he talks about this. He talks a lot about this Agrarian Reform Act. The key thing, though, is it follows on. The desire of the peasants, clearly, it's more, you can read the whole article here if you want, but Kim Il-sung clearly says the desire of the peasants is their own land. Can you go down just a little bit? Yeah, the aim, yeah, there it is, in the italics there. The aim of agrarian reform is to abolish the land ownership of the Japanese and Korean landlords and the tenant system. Yeah. The right to use the land belongs to those who till it. Oh. The agricultural system of North Korea will depend on the peasant economy, which the private ownership of the peasants who are not held in bondage to the landlord. Private, now this is their own words. This is not, nobody's translating it. Private ownership of land. So it's true, it's very true. In 1946, the Workers' Party, Kim Il-sung, the country had not yet been established as a state until 1948, but they passed this law, this massive land reform, 750,000 tenants get their own land. A massive change in ownership there. It's followed in South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan by similar acts by the U.S. Army to land reform in those countries right after World War II. A hugely successful process. It created millions and millions of little capitalists, if you think of it, people who own their own property. But they did this in North Korea as well. The thing is, about 10 years later, in 1950, after the Korean War and all that turmoil, they collectivized all that land. They took it back from the peasants and made these huge collectives. The country's really gone downhill ever since. The collective farming system, as it was in China and in the Soviet Union, was a disaster. It eventually led to famine, certainly in China and Russia, Soviets, and then many years later in North Korea as well. But my interest really is sparked by this initial speech by Kim Il-sung praising peasant ownership of land. But that's not said in the current article, right? The KCNA item just leaves it. It's what people wanted. Oh, what did they want? They wanted their own land. But the paper can't quite say that. Still, it's very interesting to me that they celebrate that anniversary, 75th anniversary of that. But it's that kind of work, I think, that we can all do to sort of better understand where they're coming from, and then also maybe helping them understand their history a little bit. Let me quickly go through some of these chapters in my paper. It's about a 20-page paper. Of course, you have to talk about Juche. I'm tired. Everybody's talking about Juche, self-reliance, but it really is an important part of Kim Il-sung's legacy. It's often misunderstood. But even in '56, I have this quote from diplomatic cable from a Soviet ambassador to Moscow. He's saying there's a very important party plenum going on. And his message to his capital is, Korea does not give up on establishing a closed-door economy and gives little attention to strengthening the connection among socialist bloc countries and forming the division of labor. Wow. I mean, we kind of know that history, but it's so helpful to see a Soviet diplomat pointing that out. That even then, Korea did not want to link up with Comecon, the Soviet bloc of command economies. You go on and on and on about Juche. The Chinese have trouble with it as well. Hungarians have trouble with it, mainly because they're not connecting their economy in the way that the Soviet bloc, the command economy system, requires of it. A lot of it is political. Kim Il-sung is a master at pushing back on both China and the Soviet Union, which he calls sort of, it's a funny word he uses, something kind of, well, he just calls them imperialists, basically, trying to control North Korea. So that's his big success overall. His career is keeping North Korea independent, no doubt. The Juche part is probably less, in his mind, is probably not so much economic, but political. And in fact, in a speech he gives later I think to Chinese, he says, we want to be independent. We love Juche. He gives a speech in 1956 that launches this Juche idea. Shortly after that, he says something like, we want to be independent of you guys, you Chinese and Russians, but we don't want to be like the Tailungun. Tailungun is the old, I guess you call him a regent for the old regime back in 1890s, I think. John, you can correct me on that. But the Tailungun sort of pulled ancient Korea back into its shell, is the way Kim Il-sung is reporting it anyway. I mean, there are a lot of good things about Tailungun, but the one thing he did, he resisted modernization. He resisted Japan. And so Kim Il-sung says, don't be like the Tailungun. We have to modernize, we have to open up. And he says our economy should be, 60, 70%. Our manufactured goods should be 60 or 70% made at home. That means 30% or so imported. That's fine. That's what he wanted. That's not autarky by any means. And in fact, it's not even that unnatural. A country like North Korea should produce 60, 70% of its own stuff. And so what he's talking about there, the autark, it's not autarkic. Now you push forward to today. I've always said North Korea is not a hermit kingdom. It's always dependent on trade. But you come up to today, and it really is very close to being a hermit kingdom. The lack of trade is so incredible with anybody. Maybe they're opening the border a little bit this month, and some of it's a lot of it's virus related, a lot of it's sanctions related, but a lot of it is policy related. So I think Kim Il-sung would be telling Kim Jong Un, open up. We don't need to be like the Tailungun. These are the kind of little things that I think you can, not little, they're important things that you can pick up by looking at this history. Now, another big point I try to make, and I don't really have time right now to handle it. When you're looking at North Korea's economy, you really have to understand this command economy system. Best call it administrative command economy system. We can call it a Marxist economy, a planned economy, a centrally planned economy, a socialist economy. Probably the best term, the most precise term, is administrative command economy system. It's totally different than a market system. And it's what the Soviets created. It's a very innovative system that doesn't require money. Can you imagine that? It's hard to imagine that. But about a third of the world, in the 50s and 60s and 70s, ran on this no money economy, a planned economy. No money means no prices. So prices didn't work. Instead, everything is dictated not necessarily from the top. There are a lot of little committees that are doing it, but they're dictating their output, all their economic decisions based on a huge plan that sort of interrelates everything. It sort of worked for the Soviet Union. Soviets are, they're mathematically inclined, and they have these huge input-output matrices. To make this amount of cars, we need this amount of steel, we need this amount of rubber, huge matrices, linear algebra, all of that. Incredible. It's the kind of thing that a company internally will do often. It's the kind of thing a whole country will do in a wartime. The U.S. during World War II kind of did that. So Ford was told to build tanks, irregardless of the money. Don't worry about money, just build tanks. That kind of thing. For the Russians, Soviets, it worked pretty well up to a point. What the system does by taking away money and pricing, all the big decisions are made politically. What do we want to make? Not will the market make. You see that a lot today with this green energy kind of stuff. If you want to get rid of carbon, what are you going to do? Well, you can try to price it, and people are trying to, but if that doesn't work, and that doesn't seem to work too well, you might just command it. You might just say, you will make electric cars, no matter what. Now, we might say, make electric cars and we'll subsidize them. Well, that's bringing in money and taxes and a lot of other stuff. But the whole concept breaks down because of complexity. Way, way too complicated. And that's what we find. Let me move on to the North Korean system of it. It's the next chapter, next section. It's different than the Soviet and Chinese planned sections. It's sort of poorly planned, actually. They try at higher level, this amount of steel, this amount of coal, this amount of coking, this amount of coal we need to make steel, da, 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 da. At a high level, it's there. But it's very clear in Kim Il-sung goes around talking to these factories all the time, and he reports on them. And he's often criticizing the factories for this, that, and the other. We've heard that Kim Jong Un does the same, but he's learned that from his grandfather. His grandfather often criticized the factories. But what he's often criticizing them for is lack of planning. In one time he goes to a steel mill, and a chemical plant, and he castigates them for, they say, well, how much are you planning? And well, we have 16 guys making the plan. They took 2 weeks to do it. He says, oh, no, you don't understand socialism. We need to have half the company working on plans, thousands of decisions, not 16 people for 2 weeks. That's kind of very realistic. If you think about the type of decisions that have to make in a chemical plant, thousands every day have to be made. I mean, 16 people can't do that. So I come away from a lot of this with understanding that Kim really, I don't know if he was an ideologue or not. I kind of think not. Was he a nationalist? Yes, of course. All Koreans are nationalists. Was he just practically trying to move along? I think that's probably the case, with a lot of Russian and Chinese pushers and shovers around him. But he was intellectually very keen on in figuring out what to do about all these factories, and having a lot of trouble with it. Clearly is having a lot of trouble with planning. That's something I think Kim Jong Un should learn, is trouble with planning. It's very much like in the last few months here, we heard, what's the big word here? We use supply chain, right? Have you ever heard of supply chain last year? No, everything's about supply chain. Well, of course, supply chain is the innards of any company. That's what they're doing. That's what we're doing. We go to the grocery store. Supply chain. What stuff do we need? Supply chain is all these millions of decisions that everybody has to make about what they're going to eat and what they're going to use to make something, right? Well, in a market economy, these are made by, each of us makes probably 100 such decisions every day. So you have in America, you have billions, even trillions of decisions made every day. In a planned economy, you have maybe thousands of such, maybe 1 million instead of 1 trillion decision makers. And the system breaks down because there are not enough good decisions made. That's why we call a market system a decentralized system, and a command economy a centralized system. Very few people make the decisions, and they don't have a lot of information to make those decisions. The system absolutely breaks down very quickly. The North Korean system sort of fights this forever. They still haven't completely gotten rid of it. They've gotten rid of a lot of the planning, not completely. The problem now becomes you have a dual system, partly planned, partly market. So prices are at work, but there's a planned system as well, and the prices don't connect. So you have very cheap electricity, and you're telling factories to make a profit. Well, they make a profit by using all the free electricity to make electricity intensive goods, even though the country is massively short of electricity. It's a crazy system, but it's a hard one to get rid of. Try raising electricity prices, which absolutely they need to do, but you immediately get lots of pushback from the people. So I mentioned the collectives, so I won't go that further in that. I think that's actually the key thing they need to do is privatize their land. Another big issue for them is comparative advantage. What should they be trading? Kim Il-sung understood that they needed to trade. So you talked a lot about exporting coal and iron ore. He didn't understand comparative advantage, which most people here don't either, but it's sort of a natural thing to move from absolute advantage, like Kim Il-sung was talking, to comparative advantage. comparative advantage is where you produce what you're best at producing, and you import what you're relatively not so good at importing. He never seemed to understand that concept, or his advisors didn't understand that concept. He didn't understand money very well at all. This is probably his biggest shortcoming. Maybe it's questions we can go into that. It's really critical now for North Korea. The money, because it's becoming a monetized economy, and the central bank people understand money pretty well, I think. But I don't think the party, the Workers' Party or the regime, understands money. And they're being very conservative with their money, which is probably good, but it's causing them to lose out on investment. So maybe that's the last thing I'll say right now. North Korea, if we look at its history, in 1945, I think, I don't think there's any argument. Remember, Kim Il-sung takes over with the Russian army takes over Northern Korea. And there's been no war in Korea. That's what we tend to forget. There's a war everywhere else in East Asia, huge wars. Japan is devastated. China is in the midst, getting ready for a huge civil war. But Korea, and especially Northern Korea, are not touched by World War II. So the Russian army comes down, takes over Northern Korea. Every little county seat they take over. Huge numbers of Red Army troops come in, take over the country, and make a total mess of it. It's amazing how bad they behave. In fact, there's a great article in the Wilson Center by this Russian colonel, Lieutenant Colonel Fedorov, who writes a blistering analysis of the Soviet Red Army's activities in North Korea, how they're treating North Korea basically like a defeated country. Well, Japan is the defeated country, not Korea, but they're treating North Korea, they're taking away all the trucks, everything that moved is called war booty, and the Russians are stealing it, and of course doing all kinds of other atrocities. They even steal the huge hydro turbine reactors from the Supong hydro plant, the biggest in Asia. The Russians come in and steal the hydro, and they move them up into Siberia someplace. They later returned them. But the point is, Kim Il-sung takes over a country that's in really pretty good shape. It's probably in better shape than any other country in Northeast Asia, industry-wise. Russians take over 1,200 factories. But probably their productivity is pretty high in 1945. By the time Kim Il-sung dies, North Korea, it goes from the best to the worst. It's by easily the poorest country in East Asia by the time Kim Il-sung dies. It's not a good record for Kim Il-sung as an economic leader. So understanding what happened between 45 and, when did he die? 93, 94, on the verge of a huge famine is critically important to understand. And I think by going through Kim Il-sung's speeches and all these diplomats, you really can understand pretty clearly what happens. Just the last thing I'd say, how do you grow? How does the country grow? How does an economy grow? In the Soviet system, it's a kind of a classical economic system, a Marx system, classical. You grow by inputs, you grow by investment. So a country produces X amount of stuff. The stuff either goes to consumption or to investment. And in the planned economy, they shift as much as they can toward investment. So Soviet Union, China, not so much China, but certainly North Korea, grew up through the mid-60s on the basis of huge investment spending, 25, 30% of GDP going to investment. This is what China does even today. Huge amounts of their output going to investment, very little in North Korea's case to consumption. So the diplomatic traffic throughout this period, the Russians, especially, even the Chinese, Zhou Enlai is complaining. He says to Kim Il-sung, you know, you're spending an awful lot of investment. That's good, but your people are in terrible shape. And Kim Il-sung says, yeah, we know. It's very sad how bad off our people are. But we just need to keep doing this so we can move up to the level of Japan. If we keep investing, we'll be at the level of Japan. So we'll just keep doing it. And the people get more and more poor, and eventually there's famine. It's so interesting to me to see the Chinese and the Russians basically trying to correct Kim Il-sung for mistakes that they know they've made in turn. Yeah. So Khrushchev, Stalin. Stalin tells Kim Jong Un, Kim Il-sung, right before the Korean War, he asked Kim Il-sung, what are you doing about privatized land, taking over the land reform? And Kim Il-sung says, well, that has to wait till unification. They're getting ready for the Korean War. That has to wait till after unification. Then we'll take over all the land, collectivize the land. So interesting that Stalin tells Kim Il-sung, go slow on that. It's dangerous. Anyway, that's enough for me right now. Hopefully I've sparked some interest in you guys.
Surely. Thank you, Bill. That was very enlightening for sure. And that paper that you wrote, which of course is not available. I don't know if you can make that available, but it's in the book as it goes into a lot of details. But so it's my pleasure now to introduce our second speaker, and Dr. John Merrill. And he is a visiting scholar at the Institute of Korean Studies, George Washington University, and an adjunct professor in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. He retired from the State Department as chief of INR's Northeast Asia Division. Dr. Merrill has held teaching and research positions at George Washington University, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Lafayette College, the University of Delaware, and Korea University. Busy guy. He's the author of Korea, The Peninsula Origins of the War, 1945 to 1950, and numerous journal articles and reviews. Dr. Merrill, we're so fortunate and grateful to have you join us here today, and appreciate coming on to deliver some questions and remarks on the presentation given, or any of your own thoughts on this topic, what we can learn from the past.
Thank you, Alan. It's very nice to meet with your group.
Yeah.
And very nice to see Bill again. We're old colleagues. When he was at the National Intelligence Council, I was over at INR. So I used to see him weekly, I would say, on matters related to North Korea. I think Bill's paper is a fine one. I think this material is pretty well known, and I think his conclusions are pretty fair from the materials that have been coming out over the years that are at the Wilson Center now and other think tanks around town. I'd like to focus on a few other things. I think on the limits of Juche and a planned economy, I think we can overinterpret. We can see a lot of these developments in terms of the internal politics of North Korea, which is very hard to get at, but occasionally we do get glimpses. And one really fascinating draft paper that I saw just a few days ago, not Bill's, but by someone other unknown author, really rocked me back a little bit, but it talked about the late Tech, and the fate that befell him. And Chinese, this is something that we don't talk about too often because it's hard to get the information. The Chinese relationship with North Korea, and particularly with a senior party guy, I think he was on the standing committee of the Politburo before he was purged. And he was the head of the Chinese security apparatus, a guy named, I'm sure I'm murdering the pronunciation, Zhou Yongkang. And he was purged a couple of years ago, and he apparently had very good connections with the North Koreans before that. But Changsung Tech was connected to or had back channel dealings with the North Koreans, and he was married to Kim Jong Il's sister, but he was living a very lavish lifestyle, and the Chinese were getting to him. He had been co-opted, clearly. And so he was purged in a very nasty way. I think he was stood up at a party meeting by some security guys and just marched out of the room, and then later executed in public. But there's a whole other story here, which is the back channel relations between the Chinese CCP and the North Koreans and their behind the scenes dealings. And I think it's not as clear cut as Bill puts it, as a clear cut choice between the old way of doing things in North Korea and opening and market reform. I think, in fact, we see in North Korea several frustrated attempts at opening and reform over the years, all of which have failed due to I don't know how to put this exactly, but unfortunate circumstances or lack of follow through. And I think North Korea has tried to reform, has tried seriously over the years to reform its economy. And I think all these reforms have failed or been half-hearted. So I agree with Bill on that point. I think North Korea has borne a terrible burden because they've got off on the wrong foot with us, and they've been in a hostile relationship with the United States. So they've had, I'd be curious how Bill feels about this. Of course, you could say it's their own fault, but they've had a tremendous defense burden that they've had to maintain or deal with. And so there are two issues. One is economic reform. The other interrelated issue is the overall security environment. And it just seems that they can never get an economic reform initiative underway in a placid security environment where they can divert the resources to the economic sector. And I don't see any prospect of that changing at all. Now, I don't know if it's true or not, but I was reading a speculative news article that the North Koreans had proposed assisting Russia in the Ukraine. And I don't know if there's any truth to this at all, but it would make sense. Their comparative advantage is probably to be the new Hessians of the Russian state. And so we'll see what happens with this, but I'm afraid that there's no no prospect that I can see of their. I believe they've made halting efforts at economic reform, stabs at that for many, many years. But to do it successfully, everything has to be right. And North Korea has never had the security environment where the big changeover from the military to the civilian economy could be undertaken with any degree of security or assurance that it would work. And the South Korean president recently proposed, just on Liberation Day, a major aid package. We don't know details, but that the South would help North Korea in a big way if they abandon their nuclear program. Well, that's part of it, yeah. But the other part of it is security assurances, and that's our role. And we're not prepared to enter into any serious discussions with them. It's been decades since the State Department has been involved in those discussions, and none of it has worked. And meanwhile, the North Korean nuclear program chugs along. I don't know what the number of estimated weapons worth of material that they now have on hand. I've seen figures in the 60s or 70s. Are probably they've gone beyond that now because the figures that I've seen, old figures, unclassified, numbers are that they can produce maybe 17 nuclear weapons a year. So, you could do the arithmetic and come up with a number, but I think we're dealing with a nuclear arsenal now that is at least 80 weapons, probably, and could fast be approaching 100. And we have a very competitive relationship between the two Koreas. It's a kind of zero-sum game for sovereignty by both the North and the South. And I think you see, on the other hand, our allies in the region growing increasingly concerned about this situation with the size of the North Korean arsenal and worries about the viability of the United States as an ally. So I know this is a little bit off topic, but that's what I'm concerned with mostly these days. And I hope North Korea gets religion and does make the big changeover. And I think, I hope that we provide an environment in which they can do that. But, the United States has got to get off its high horse of just bad-mouthing the North Korean nuclear program and start negotiating with them. This isn't that hard to do. I was personally involved in some of these negotiations. One of my interlocutors was a nice young lady who is now the North Korean foreign minister. She's smart. None of these top officials are dense. They get it. They get the trade-offs that Bill mentioned. And they'd like to get the economy moving again, but they're not going to do it at the expense of their security concerns. So anyway, we have a hell of a problem on our hands, and I don't see anyone in this administration, like others, doing a damn thing about it. I might also say, and this is not the official line, but a large part of this is our own fault. We had the bomb to ourselves, and then later in a diarchy with the Soviet Union for many, many years. And I still remember, I have done some historical research on the period of the Korean War and immediately after. And we brandished those nuclear weapons in a very menacing way at Eisenhower's inauguration in the early 50s. And you can find online pictures of the atomic cannon rolling down in front of the old post office, in front of what subsequently became the Trump Hotel. And it was clearly designed to send a message that if negotiations didn't quickly wind the Korean War up, we'd find other ways to do that. And the other way would be going nuclear. So anyway, we have unleashed the nuclear demon on the peninsula. We did it. And now we're being haunted by it. So anyway, that's about all that I'd say. I think Bill has a fine paper. I don't have any issues with it. But that's the main thing I'm concerned with these days. And I'm afraid we're headed in a bad direction. And I don't see any likelihood that that's going to change. So that's what I have to say.
Okay, well, thank you, John. And we really appreciate sharing that. Yeah, no, it's a challenging situation, no doubt, for the people trying to make decisions now as they were when you were involved actively as well. I want to go to one part of Bill's paper that this issue of, you mentioned, Bill, when they in fact, you have a statement here in your paper that says that Kim changed the country's strategy in the early 1970s, opening up to the capitalist West, turned to Western Europe and Japan for industrial equipment purchased on credit. So I think you were saying that in order, an effort to modernize back in that period of time, they did open up to the world economy. You mentioned many tons of equipment and capital goods brought into the country, and they built up a certain debt on that then they never paid back, sounded like. And that has then precluded some of the further interactions with the world to provide those kind of goods. And you mentioned also there was some effort at one point to rework those debts, but it was unsuccessful. Maybe that's a little bit what John was referring to also. Can you speak to some of that part of your discussion about what Kim Il-sung left for the current administration?
Yeah, it's John makes a good point that North Korea has tried to reform different ways, and open up several different times. I actually make a distinction between reform and open. I think often they've tried to open. As Kim Il-sung says, we don't want to be like Taewon. We want to be open. We need technology. We need coking coal. We need this, that, the other thing. The problem to me has always been on the reform side, and I define reform very specifically as price reform, market reform, making the economy work on money and prices rather than plan. I know it's sort of a black and white kind of a way thinking. And the world is not black and white. We have plenty of non-market activities ourselves, more and more, I'm afraid. And China has more and more, by now, pretty much of a monetized economy. North Korea sits kind of firmly in the middle and is having a hard time going from one side to the other. And that awkward middle is terrible for productivity. It's terrible for trading as well, because so when they tried to open up to Western Europe in the 70s. South Korea was starting to boom based on foreign investment pouring in. Kim Il-sung, well, we need some of that. So he gets it. He gets a couple $2 billion worth of European equipment. They're still using it. It's good stuff. But he doesn't reform the pricing. So, for example, a power plant, as I was mentioning, has to try to its electricity is almost free. It can't charge. The coal that it uses is almost free. The capital is extremely expensive or not available. So it just makes the power plant, makes the decision makers, the very smart people trying to figure out how much should we import, how are we going to pay for it. It's just catastrophically difficult to do in this mixed system. And so they defaulted. They were the first sovereign socialist country to default. And they really never cleared those accounts. They still have this very bad reputation of not paying back debts. It may by now be not deserved. People go, bankruptcy is there for a reason. You should be able to work out of a bankruptcy. They've never, and this, I think a lot of the fault has been the West, giving them loans that they know the North Koreans can't pay back. That's not allowed in our economy. You can't make such loans. You're not allowed to. Predatory lending is not allowed. I would argue North Korea is the victim of lots of predatory lending, but it's also a victim of a lot of predatory aid. And I go into a whole section in my paper on how much aid it's gotten, especially from Russia, from China, amazingly from East Germany after the Korean War. But up until recently, they're always getting aid. Now, this is what's changed in the last few years. They're not getting any aid. And, I think the economy has, up until this coronavirus, or maybe until the Chinese really clamped down on trade, I think the economy was doing better without the aid, because the aid sort of eviscerates, it kills exports. North Korea was a good exporting country in the Japanese era, very good exporter. By now, it's the worst exporter in the world. Why? I think it's because of all this aid that's poured in. You don't export unless you have to, and you don't have to if you get aid. So they haven't. The export industries are just totally atrophied. They should have a lot of zinc. Zinc, if you noticed in the newspaper today, skyrocketing price of zinc, right, in England, because some problem. North Korea has some of the world's largest supplies of zinc. They should maybe be making a pile of money on that. But they've never been able to sort of square this market pricing with their socialist plan. That, I think, is their critical thing. One other thing with what John said, which I quite agree with, I don't think we're making the right kind of moves with North Korea. And I think a lot of it is, I would say by now, our fault. Not initially, but by now we should have somehow figured out a way to do this. We haven't. But a example of something I'd like to try to push, but it's zero chance of going anywhere. If you think about this dual pricing system back in the 45 when they started, you have to recognize a market economy can't trade normally with a socialist planned economy because the prices are so different. It screws up both of them. Say, for example, free electricity in North Korea. Oh, North Korea would be exporting aluminum to America, even though they don't have any aluminum, right? It just screws up everything. It's bad for us and bad for them. So the whole world trading relationships were developed, the GATT and then the WTO, to split apart the socialist planned economies from the market economies. You can trade sort of with trade agreement, but not on a market basis. Now that has all changed tremendously as China joins the WTO, becomes a market economy. Even Russia, everybody's in the WTO, except North Korea. So North Korea, we treat North Korea with these huge tariffs. Even if there are no sanctions, North Korea can't really export here because we have such high tariffs on it. The tariffs are logical back in 1948, very logical, necessary. They're not really necessary anymore because I think if you look carefully, if you do the research, I think North Korean pricing internally, except for a few items like electricity, I think they really are at a market price level. And so that really, I think North Korea could join the WTO with little effort if it would just apply and if we would encourage them to do that. That would allow them, if and when sanctions are finally lifted, to start exporting to the US. That would be a huge boost to them. That would give some push to the sanctions, actually. It would make it worthwhile for North Korea to get rid of the sanctions. Right now, there's not too much reason to get rid of the sanctions because they can't export to us anyway. Anyway, there are a lot of things here that, we could be doing that we're not. I'm completely agreed with John on that. I don't argue that it's particularly our fault. I think it's mostly theirs. Kim Jong Un can make some good decisions, get himself and his country out of this mess. But, we don't know the internal politics very well. And maybe there's some constraints there. We just can't do it.
Thank you, Bill. Appreciate that. I have a question from the audience.
If I could just add something to what Bill said.
Yeah, go ahead, John.
Yeah, I agree, Bill, with your comments, but what I see happening right now is the world splitting into two competing economic and trade blocs. It's a process that's incomplete and just in its initial stages. One bloc is the former Soviet Union and the socialist regimes that it, formerly socialist regimes that it still holds close to it, some of the stance, for example, and China, and some ne'er-do-well regimes like Iran and others in the Middle East. And I think the global trading system that we've come to know and love has fallen into a bit of disrepute in recent years. And that has to be attended to. And I see no evidence that the US government is making the required effort to do that. And so I think this process is going to continue. And we're seeing a rupture of the world economy to some extent. And the other thing that I have to say that disturbs me is I see us, because of some unfortunate developments like the Ukraine, marching right up to the borders of the Soviet Union. So NATO is butting up against the Warsaw Pact, and there's no buffer in between. And so the Scandinavian countries and the Baltic states are all joining NATO, and this process is going to continue. And so we're going to be in a very different world soon, and we're going to be at the mercy of developments in these various states, and we're going to have to deal with them in a wise way. And I don't see us as having any more the foreign this is not a comment on the Biden administration. It's a process that I'm afraid has been going on for some years, but I don't see us any longer as having the capacity, assuming we ever did in the past, to do that. And so I think we're in a much more dangerous world going forward. Why in God's name? I understand why some of these smaller countries, for their own self-protection, might want to sign up to NATO, but I don't think it's a very good idea for us to be handing out these security guarantees like flyers on the street corner to anyone and anyone who approaches us. And I think it's going to get us into trouble at some point. Maybe this is the Mersheimer analysis, but I think there's some value to that approach, to that the way of looking at things.
No, I agree with you completely, John. Yeah.
Wow,
this unusual agreement between old colleagues.
Two old friends. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I have a question from our audience here that will take us back to Korea. It says, in 2018, Kim Jong Un and Moon Jae-in discussed updating the decrepit rail system in North Korea and connecting the rail system between the two countries. Could allowing limited trade between North and South Korea bring some economic reform? Could it be a spark for economic reform? Bill, what do you think?
Yeah, I love that train issue because I always like to say my mother, who you mentioned, was born in Korea, and my dad in China. They could actually, I'm not sure they ever did, they could get on the train in Mokpo, that's a southwest corner of South Korea. That's where they live. Mokpo, Korea. They could get on the train and end up in Paris, France without getting off. This was in like 1930, right? So when the Koreans talking about linking the land, okay, all right. I think an airplane is a lot faster. People I know who did that say it's, a really boring railroad trip through Siberia. Nothing to see but trees. So I don't. It's interesting, but to me, it's a step too far. The last thing that needs to happen in North Korea now is infrastructure investment. I like a lot of what President Yoon has been talking about, but this aid program for North Korea, this is a little bit what Trump was talking about too. I think it was it's the right idea, but it's the mechanics are wrong. North Korea doesn't want Samsung trooping through Korea selling semiconductors to China. The last thing, if I were North Korea, I wouldn't want that. They're afraid of these foreign companies, and they should be. What they should be doing, though, is making these changes at a micro level in their own economy, and they are doing some of this, to make their own companies more competitive and to be able to sell stuff to the South Korean giants and to the Russians. That would make a lot of sense. Eventually, that would be great, right? And eventually, it probably will happen. These railroads probably will be restored, but it's not time yet. One thing, though, I really liked about President Yoon earlier, maybe a month ago, he said something like he wanted to open up South Korea to North Korean propaganda. I think that would be great idea. That's just a terrific. South Korea, they censor stuff coming from North Korea, all this propaganda, and it is propaganda, no doubt. So South Koreans, I think, are a little bit weak in looking at North Korea. But if they opened up to North Korean propaganda, first thing you can bet the North Korean propaganda would get much more realistic very quickly. And I'm all for South Koreans studying this North Korean economy at a very disciplined level, at a microeconomics level. One guy, Kim Jong Un, has a nice book out there in English. It's a little bit hard to read, but it's very technical. It goes into a lot of material that I've been talking about. I would highly recommend it. It's about 3 or 4 years old. But understanding how this socialist system works and doesn't work, to me, is critical to dealing with North Korea. And, I would say our people here in Washington don't have the foggiest idea of any of that.
All right, thank you, Bill.
All they think about is nukes.
We have a few minutes left. I know John would like to respond to that. Two good old friends.
No, I'm in agreement with everything that Bill just said. I just wanted to relate an amusing anecdote. When I first came on board at the State Department, I think it was way back in the 80s, I was a
I remember that. I was already
author.
here for 10 years.
I was a blacklisted author in South Korea because I had tried to form a realistic perception based on archival materials in the U.S. archives and military documents. You could get an unofficial researcher's clearance to them in the various other places around town. But initially, the South Korean government was having none of that until they discovered that I had signed up with INR. And I think my first meeting with an NIS contact, a National Intelligence Service contact, I complained about that. And lo and behold, just like Joe Biden and some of the oligarchs in Eastern Europe, suddenly my name disappeared from the blacklist overnight. So in the old days, it was pretty tough in South Korea. And I agree with Bill. It would be good if there could be more openness, at least at the academic exchange level. And you can get into good conversations with the North Koreans if you're in a meeting with them. And we hosted them several times here at Stanford University. I remember one time, maybe I shouldn't mention names, but I do remember that the current foreign minister, Madam Che, was in attendance at several of those sessions. And the discussion was pretty candid and open. And so I think that's a good sign if we can have those kinds of discussions. And I don't see any reason for the U.S. government to put them all on lockdown indefinitely. Maybe it simplifies their drawing up their schedule of decision makers because there's one country that's off the boards. I don't see how you can discuss the nuclear problem without North Korea. So Anyway, that's all that I want to say. A former blacklisted author in South Korea until I joined the US government, and then magically overnight my name was off the blacklist. There wasn't anything on there. If you can find the book, you can read it, and you won't find anything
Thank
outrageous.
you. Good story. Bill, do you have any concluding remarks you want to say before we have to part ways? You think you think it's inevitable that the North Korea economy finally does open up?
Finally, it's a long time.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's inevitable, but it might be a very long time.
Well, I
I think
disagree.
there's a lot of progress happening now, though, to tell you the truth.
It may open up, in my opinion, but I don't know where it's going to go, because I don't
Yeah.
know that we're going to have the same type of world economy that we've had for the
Again,
last few decades.
Yeah, again, to me, better term is reform. I always say reform, then open.
Yeah.
For
them to open without reforming, it would be catastrophic for them. And I think they know that. So the reform, meaning getting prices right, getting wages up for their state, and it's a very difficult budget kind of issue that a normal government has to deal with. And they're facing these budget kind of issues that are very hard to deal with. So,
okay. Well, thank you both. Really appreciate coming on, sharing with our audience.
I am sorry we didn't get to the questions in the chat, but
I got to one of them.
Oh, you did? Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Well, I can hang along. I can hang around for a while. If you want to read those questions to Bill and I, and
all right. Well, we'll do one more question here. This was about the economy. It said, under Kim Il-sung government, the country saw an impressive economic development from 1953 to 75. It went from mostly an agricultural society to an urban industrial one. Factories rebuilt, industrial reproduction recovered. What happened during the rest of their economic growth?
After 75.
I mean, after 75.
So this is a very excellent question, but it's the way I picture growth. So the growth comes the earlier period by input-driven growth, force-fed investment, tremendous numbers of factories built, a lot of human capital. Everybody learns to read and write. Huge amounts of capital invested in the country. The problem, though, was if pushed too hard, the return on investment, the return on capital naturally declines. So their return on that investment without price reform became worse and worse and worse. So it's like you're pushing harder and harder and harder to eke out little bit of growth. And by the 1980s, and as John mentioned, also a huge amount on the military. That just sort of kills them over time. And they have this huge famine that just destroyed their industry.
I agree with everything that Bill just said.
Okay, very good. I'm glad we got that good question in there. Thank you for that. Fascinating. So I need to close here for everyone. We hope you can join us for future programs every week at this time, 2:30 p.m. Eastern time on Tuesdays for different perspectives. And this is recorded and was posted on Facebook here, so you could find the link and be able to share that with people or revisit it. And the IED program, we do have a mailing list. You can get on that. I don't know if Roger, you can put that in the chat real quick. So you could click on that if you'd like to sign up for future notifications. But John, we really appreciate your coming on. And Bill, you've been with us a few times. We appreciate all your efforts to educate our audience. And so long, everyone.
Thank you, Alan.
Thank you now.
Bye, Bill.
See you, John.
Take care, man.
Yeah, you too.
Thank you speakers for a great job. God bless you all.
Thank you. Thank you.